we as doctors, we want to be really sure that every medication that is prescribed to people is helping them in a meaningful way, either to prolong life or make life better.
Now, lots of things can impact how and if a person with epilepsy takes them prescribed medications. So we are going to be speaking about this with Samuel Terman, an epileptologist and researcher from the University of Michigan, US, who's done some really interesting research into adherence to medications, polypharmacy, deprescribing, and the high rate of multiple illnesses or disabilities amongst people with epilepsy. Samuel also uses lingo that some people might not be overly familiar with. I confess I had to Google a couple of the words. Hence, we've added these to the Epilepsy Sparks glossary. Stay tuned to learn more, and if you'd like to learn more about epilepsy and epilepsy research every week for free, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell down there for notifications. And if you're already a fan of the channel, actually we'd really appreciate it if you could like this video, because it makes a huge difference to us and enables more people to see content about epilepsy, and that's content that can be trusted. So let's improve outreach, epilepsy awareness, understanding and research. Hello Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you please tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks so much, Torie. My name is Dr. Sam Terman. I'm an epileptologist at the University of Michigan. I have a lot of interests, as I have overwhelmed Torie with 10 of my last papers. I've given her some homework assignments to read.
Must read them. Everyone else, I mean, yeah.
So I have a lot of interests, one of which is health services outcomes, the processes and outcomes by which we take care of people with epilepsy. Another one is about risk prediction, just predicting how effective is treatment day versus no treatment. So it's a lot of stuff that I think is really interesting and of practical importance. You kind of imagine, if you turn on the weather, you look to the weatherman for some predictions about is it going to rain today. You need to understand kind of what's the probability of something good, something bad happening. Kind of the analogy in my work is directly what's the chance that people are going to adhere to their medications? What's the chance that people are going to be readmitted to the hospital? What's the chance if I continue versus stop this seizure medicine that I'm going to have another seizure? So there are all kinds of these kind of prediction elements to my work that I think all kind of have practical implications about how you take care of people and what should you be most and least worried about.
How much of your time is now spent in research versus with people with epilepsy?
It's about 75% research and 25% clinical care that's split between reading EEGs and seeing patients in the clinic, particularly in epilepsy clinic.
You mentioned to me beforehand in our previous chat, polypharmacy. And that is something which, I'm personally familiar with. I can't say I'm too happy with it necessarily. We have to weigh things up. But tell us about your paper into that.
So your response is, is not an unusual one. A little bit of background. Polypharmacy, it's a word that just means that people take lots of medications. And we as doctors and all patients, we're always trying to prioritize, what's the most important thing. There's no one ever who says, I wish I could take twice as many medications, There was actually a survey of older adults in the US where they found about 2/3 of older adults in the US said, I wish I could take fewer medications. And there are hundreds of thousands of emergency room visits a year for adverse reactions of medications. There are drug interactions between all the medications that we take, and they have just all kinds of side effects potentially. So that said, it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde, and Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde moment, because the medicines, they have their downsides, but there's so much good that, medications treat so many things. We have blood pressure, is very treatable, and mood and depression, so you can make a big difference in people's lives with treating them with the right medicines at the right time. So it can go good and go bad. But in terms of that kind of, prediction stuff that I was talking about, I've done a couple papers about just quantifying how many medications do people take with people with epilepsy, how common is polypharmacy, how many medications do people take, how many prescribers do they have, just to kind of crystallize a bit of, what's the current situation. And so, for example, I did one paper using Medicare data. Medicare is the U.S. Public insurer that takes care of both older adults and also there are other ways that you can get in, like disability. And so I studied 80,000 people with epilepsy that are in this database over a few years.
Fair number. Yeah.
Yeah, not bad. And the average number of medications that people were prescribed in a year was 12.
That is nuts. Sorry, just to say, but that is.
And the average
Wow.
number of
Yeah.
uniquely prescribing providers was 5. So if there are different ways. One common way of categorizing polypharmacy is, do you take at least 5 medications? It's out there in the literature, and fully 90% of this population was prescribed at least 5, as compared to, in Medicare population, it's an older, and a sicker population. So I guess the general figure would be about half. So it's high, but 90% is greater than 50%.
Yay.
In addition, I found that about 1 in 5 took an opioid medication, and after Keppra being the number 1 most commonly prescribed medication, Norco was the number 2 prescribed medication, which is an opioid, and 60% of people took at least 3 central nervous system acting medications. So it's really kind of a wake-up call. The numbers are somewhat alarming. They're somewhat less alarming if you look at the general population, and I have also done another similar study using the NHANES database, which is a nationally representative U.S. population, not oversampling older or disabled people, and it was still pretty high in the overall U.S. population. It was a smaller sample, but it was 50% there. It took at least 5 medications. So at first view, it's kind of shocking, but as you think about it a bit more, I think, well, I take my seizure medication. Some people take 2 or 3 seizure medications. Depression, I take my antidepressant. I take my, medications for pain. I take medication for blood pressure. I take medication. So it really adds up pretty quickly. But then it's just, more and more and more. I think there are some practical implications of this where we as doctors, we want to be really sure that every medication that is prescribed to people is helping them in a meaningful way, either to prolong life or make life better, as opposed to kind of it's a lot easier to add than subtract medications.
Sometimes the side effects can outweigh the potential benefits. And I think just taking people off medications for that reason, or what we say to be the reason, can be quite challenging for clinicians. Absolutely.
Sometimes the issue is I don't feel like this is my medication to manage. I have a really specific role in a lot of patients' care, which is the epilepsy. And then, I just kind of take lots of other medications, and, but I'm not the main decider. But another main challenge is that sometimes you're kind of just comparing apples and oranges. You're saying, well, I could take this and be less likely to have a seizure, or I can not take this and be less likely to have side effects. And it's a real, I think this is just a common day-to-day challenge that we all face as people. It's just kind of weighing these apples and oranges when it's kind of hard to make decisions.
Well, and a lot of us really are, if not the majority of us, are clinicians and aren't specifically trained in epileptology and psychiatry and everything else that goes with it. So we completely and utterly, no pressure, rely upon you guys.
Well, yeah, I mean, that I can see that. I mean, I think the other way, though, is that sometimes patients, I kind of ask patients, why are you taking this medication? And the response is, well, because my doctor prescribed it. And, that could be a totally fair reason. But on the other hand, I just, I get a little worried when I hear that response, because I want to just make sure that a patient knows why they're on the medication and has some reasonable assurance that, they believe that it's indeed helping them.
And that there is choice.
Yeah, right.
Tell us about the piece that you did on suddenly stopping medications, or stopping medications in any way, shape or form, and do no harm.
So do no harm is, doctors all recognize this term. We took the Hippocratic Oath, which is, which is a text that you read and abide by when you enter the profession of medicine. And, everyone believes that, we're all scared to do something that you feel like is going to hurt the patient, but there's no free lunch, someone's going through epilepsy surgery, clearly there's a lot of potential benefit, but it's also, surgery, and There's a lot of, so, this do no harm concept, it must be balanced by, you know, do no net harm. I guess that's the other way of
That's a good
saying
way
it.
to put it.
You want to be sure that the benefit outweighs the potential downside. And so specifically what you're talking about is this decision that has been interesting to me is when to stop seizure medications. Because when people develop epilepsy, the standard treatment is to start an anti-seizure medication, and tons of choices that you can start. And the good news is that seizure medications are pretty effective. Kind of the standard numbers are about half of people with epilepsy, their seizures will be controlled by a single medication, and then in total two-thirds of people with epilepsy, you'll control their seizures with medication. So that's fantastic. And then the even better news is that people have done studies in terms of predicting if you have been cooled off for a while, you haven't had a seizure for a few years, if you stop seizure medications, what's the risk that you're going to have another seizure even if you stop? So like the best possible situation is, well, I've been stabilized. There comes a time when maybe I don't need this forever. And so people have done risk estimates and said, well, maybe 30-40% of people who have been seizure-free for a couple of years can come off their medicines and not have a seizure again, at least in the kind of the reasonable kind of, medium term. So that's good news, but still selecting those candidates is just, it's hard, but I think it's such an interesting problem because, problem number one is just the percent. Like, do I know what is the chance that you have a seizure if you continue versus if you stop your meds? And that's something that I'm actively researching. I'm doing some trial reanalysis. There's actually the biggest trial that pertained to adults was done in the UK. There are 40 centers and they're investigators in Liverpool. And so it's the biggest and, perhaps the best study to date. And so I'm doing some reanalysis of that to try to get the best possible percentages of what's the risk of having another seizure if you stop versus if you don't. I have lots of other future plans based on that. So, but, that's one element. The next element that's involved in this is how do you want to receive that risk? How do you manipulate that percent? Because if you tell someone your chance is 30%, that's subtly different than your chance is 3 in 10 or 1 in 3, which is different.
Also, what's really important, I think, is for any patients that might be listening as well, like we are all so very different. So say, for instance, if I haven't had a seizure for 2 years and I'm considering coming off my anti-seizure meds, that's very different to somebody else who hasn't had a seizure for 2 years and considering coming off their seizure medications. It's not one size fits all, right?
There's no one size fits all. I think there's a kind of guideline, or there has been guidelines that patients with epilepsy, after they've been seizure-free for about 2 years, it might be reasonable to have the discussion. But everyone is so different. Some people will say, no, I'm happy, those seizures were the worst. I've stabilized. I don't want to rock the boat, and their driving implications. I need to drive to work. I've got kids, and I don't want to risk it. Other people might say, no, the seizures, I didn't have that many. They were kind of not the big bad shaking kind. Driving it, I can forgo driving for a little bit. If I have another one, I'll just go back on. And, geez, I'm kind of, that there are all kinds of side effects. I'm a little fuzzy thinking, having a little word finding trouble. I think it's from the medication. So the balance is just going to be so different from person to person. And some of my future work, I hope, will be aimed at kind of, parsing through, kind of what preferences, what people, what ranges of seizure risk, does the good outweigh the bad or vice versa.
And it's interesting because what some people think is good or bad, other people don't, right? It's completely and utterly individual.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. The way that I kind of, in trials, we, when you randomize people in a clinical study to treatment A or treatment B, there's generally a primary outcome. Like, we specify this is the thing that this trial is most important, but every patient's primary outcome is different. Your primary outcome might be, I never want to have a seizure again. Someone else's primary outcome may be, I never want to take another medication again. So just what you're saying.
And I'm really glad that you're actually researching this, because it's something that is, I don't know, often comes up in conversation between patients, but often you don't necessarily have enough time to have that full in-depth conversation with your clinician.
And so, I think the point of my work is not to say that, people are on so many drugs and, people should come off their seizure medicines, because as I say, it's a Jekyll and Hyde moment where, there's good and the bad, and everyone's calculus is going to be different. But I do think that it's really useful to just describe the current state of things, describe the medications that people are taking, and for patients, to really, feel like their medications are helping them, and just to kind of, for the withdrawal discontinuation decision, just to be aware that some people with epilepsy and medications, maybe you don't have to take medications forever, and it's just something that some people have maybe even never talked to their doctor about, just even to have the conversation, like, I didn't even know this was possible. I just thought that I would, be taking my seizure medicine forever and ever. And, that could be the case, but just have you ever had the conversation?
I'd like to add, if anybody is thinking, or your loved one might be thinking, or your patient might be thinking of just stopping your drugs, don't do it. And I can speak from personal experience. I was going through a bit of a meltdown many years ago, and I did it, even though I knew I shouldn't do it. And I was basically saying, seizures, come here, please. That was fun. Not. Please don't do it, because you not just increase your risk of seizures, but also SUDEP even. So yeah, it's got to be managed, right?
Absolutely. That's right. It's a conversation with your doctor about kind of what's the smartest thing for you.
So one other thing what we were going to mention was, terminology. For instance, the term adherence or compliance. You've done some work on, not just what the definitions are, but go into more detail for us.
Yeah, I've done a few recent papers about medication adherence. So, the terminology has swung more towards the word adherence compared to compliance. Adherence is, there's kind of a little bit of a negative connotation to compliance. You will do as you are told, which is really not.
If they say you are non-compliant, I'm like, I didn't do it on purpose, sorry.
Right. Me, no. So, but adherence implies that a recommendation is made. The patient has understood that recommendation clearly, which is, not always a given, and the patient agrees that that is the best thing for them. So there is a multiple step thing. I understand the recommendation, I agree it's a good idea, but then still at that point, medications fall through the cracks because of either forgetting pills or having trouble, logistical things, or couldn't refill them, and there are just all kinds of reasons why, people may or may not adhere to their medications. But you're right. The terminology is kind of like, so what, potato, but on the other hand, it's like you want to be talking about the right thing in the right way. So for example, I published two papers recently, one of which was about in people with newly diagnosed epilepsy. I took 25,000 people and I followed them to see what their adherence to seizure medications would be like. And, the database it's again Medicare, just because that's kind of, I've been doing a lot of work recently in that database. And so the population is pretty particular. And what you have is fills, medication fills. And so I counted up the percent of days when they actually had pills. So that was kind of my definition of adherence. Just, what percent of days do you actually have medication? And then I took that a few steps further, where sometimes when people study adherence, they kind of just dichotomize it into a yes-no thing. Good, bad, but it's not that simple. It's not a black and white thing. And then also sometimes in a lot of previous adherence work, it has just been at a single moment in time or a single time period, but adherence can change. And so those are a couple of the innovations that I did in this recent work, which was trajectories. And so I grouped people into kind of the group of patients that started strong, that had a full pill supply and stayed there throughout several years, compared to people who started filling their pills consistently and then dropped off, compared to the reverse, people who were really inconsistently filling their pills throughout, and the people who were inconsistently filling their pills and then picked it up kind of over time. So I define these four different trajectories of adherence to anti-seizure medications. And in the 25,000 people that I studied with new epilepsy, 60% of them were in this early adherence group, which is the people who were consistently filling, which is good, but that also means that of people where you think they actually have epilepsy and a reason to be on seizure medications, 40% of them were in the other groups. So, kind of my work is, on both sides of the aisle. On one side, some of my work is about, polypharmacy and, sometimes talking about your doctor about whether considering withdrawing medication eventually might be the right choice for you. But some of my other work has been, acknowledging seizure medicines are helpful. You talked about SUDEP. Seizure medications reduce injuries and seizures and suit up and hospitalizations and all kinds of potential downsides. And so it's kind of a wake-up call on both sides, I think. But on the other hand, it's not entirely new. I mean, a lot of literature is, has already shown there's so many barriers that can get in the way of people filling their medications. And I think it's kind of interesting, though, to map these four different trajectories, kind of, because it kind of tells a different story. So the person who starts high and stays high, maybe they really believe they have a reason to be on the medication, appropriately so, and they're motivated to keep filling the medication. People who kind of start lower and then pick it up, you could potentially tell a story there about how someone, the reason that people might say, I don't know if I need this yet. I want to wait. I want to see. So, there are just all kinds of things. And it's with these claims databases that it's all such a high level in terms of just,
right.
Are you
So we don't know the
feeling ill?
reasons
So,
necessarily for.
the next steps are really, yeah, the reasons, the kind of more granular data. This is hypothesis generating. There are a couple other interesting findings from that particular paper. One was that having a neurologist was associated with really good adherence, being in that kind of early and continued adherence group. And so, I think that's a really interesting finding because it's actionable potentially, but it's also interesting because there's so many different possible explanations. So one possible explanation is that, neurologists have value, specialists have value in terms of counseling their patients. This is why I think you should be on this medication, and then detecting when people are on maybe not the right medication for them and switching them to something that might be, a better choice. So one possibility is causality. Neurologist, helps. Another possibility is that more motivated people seek out neurologist care, and therefore it's a non-causal relationship whereby it's just the people who get into your study and happen and decide to see a neurologist. So there, with any good study, it answers some things and it raises even more questions for the next step in the research process.
You've got another thing that you were going to mention or just explain about the threefold increased physical disability rate amongst people with epilepsy. This is, this is a really big deal. Please tell us about that.
As I said, I gave Torie her homework to read, and she's done it.
Thanks.
A plus. Hey. So another set of studies that I did was about defining the prevalence of physical disability in people with epilepsy. So in that study, I used NHANES data. So that's the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. That's so in the U.S. This is a really long-standing survey, and they sample people across the U.S. in different communities in such a way that you can actually generalize results to the whole country. So it's a really neat in terms of its survey design, and they send out a truck, an examination unit out, and they just go around the whole country. So it's great for saying, like, what's the prevalence of this and that and that. They do all kinds of common stuff. And they have a set of physical limitations questions. So they ask people questions about, do you have trouble getting upstairs and trouble sitting for a long time and trouble standing and trouble walking and how far can you walk? And they do a couple objective measures too. So I use these data for two things. The first study was to compare physical disability in people with epilepsy compared to people without epilepsy. Again, kind of just, in the business of just describing the state of things to understand what's a problem. And as you say, I found that people with epilepsy that I defined as people who reported being treated with a seizure medication and some other methods to it. So I had 100, 200 people with epilepsy, and there are thousands and thousands of people without epilepsy. And I found that the people with epilepsy, or at least being treated for seizures, reported threefold increase in physical disabilities compared to everyone else, which is all these measures that you're talking about, like standing and walking and lifting and grabbing and just all the things you've got to do to get by and take care of yourself. And there are a lot of reasons. The epilepsy itself, is that's probably not the primary reason here, because on a day-to-day basis,
it depends on the
possibly,
if you've got refractory epilepsy or not, and
it
type of
depends on the
seizures,
person, it depends on the thing. Certainly, yes, seizures seizures are directly responsible for you not driving, but that wasn't one of the questions. So people with seizures have stroke, and people with seizures have developmental abnormalities, and they've had seizures their whole lives, or cerebral palsy and pain conditions, and there's so many things that or you can have a seizure and hurt yourself, injure yourself, and you can have physical. There are just so many different pathways.
You just made me think of one example of how it can be difficult, I think, sometimes to measure the impact on a person's quality of life. And for instance, if you've got a really supportive, loving family who are totally with you, and say you have comorbidities, physical comorbidities in addition to the epilepsy, but they are there for you and they support you, you're likely, generally speaking, to be a bit more content than somebody who is obviously generalizing, but somebody who did not have that support. And so physically you could, and neurologically, you could be identical in inverted commas, but how you feel is completely and utterly different. So how do you measure that?
I think your point is that there are a lot of things that are not always measured in research that it would be great if we do. Mm-hmm. There are things like, for example, with withdrawal, post-withdrawal seizure prediction, lifestyle factors we often don't measure in these trials, like sleep and mood and hygiene and alcohol intake, and there are all kinds of things that would make our risk predictions better, to tailor our risk predictions to that individual, and all the other things that influence the risk other than the EEGs, and number of seizures that are things that we do typically capture. For adherence and polypharmacy and quality of life, the things that you're talking about are really important too, in terms of your social support, that very much tie into, do you have a buddy system that can kind of hold you accountable to actually making sure that you're taking your medications right, and asking the right questions to your doctor. So I always do find it helpful when patients bring in a spouse or a friend or someone else who can kind of just provide some additional input and remember the things that the doctor is saying, and provide some comment about what's this person, how are they doing, what's their quality of life, what are the things that they've told you that are most important to them. When the person says, oh, I totally forgot, I'm so glad you reminded me to say that. So,
well, sometimes I think people can be a bit nervous to say something. We should never, but be nervous or a bit embarrassed. Well, actually, this happened, or I went out on the lash the other night, and yes, I had seizures, and I kind of blame myself, but they're too embarrassed to say it. So if you have somebody that you trust that can come with you, and another thing also is I know somebody who was unfortunately in repeat status epilepticus, on and off for about a month. It was horrific, and she thought she'd had 4 seizures, and she'd had in the 20s, but she didn't know because of her lack of consciousness. So it's really can be extraordinarily useful, almost crucial in if I can use that word, in getting the most effective treatment, because if you present this information to your neurologist?
Yeah, I mean, epilepsy is something that it's interesting that we study an organ system that is aware of itself. You know, the brain studies itself. So we ask for symptoms, but if someone can't describe them because they were unconscious, it just does make it harder to, you know, to care for the person unless we have a really good account from a buddy, from a friend, from a witness, from a video recording.
Videos can be great, huh?
You know, those are all useful. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I think certainly there are all kinds of things that people are kind of too embarrassed to say, and you know, but I hope that any patients who are watching this are encouraged to be really honest with their doctor about, you know, this is why I miss pills. You know, I miss them sometimes, and I admit that, and I realize that, you know, no one's perfect, and I'm doing the best I can, and here are the reasons. You know, this is either the reason is I just forget, or I don't have a good system, or I need a buddy, or I'm not sure that I need them, or I'm having side effects and I want to talk about if there are other options for me. So, you know, all these things I think tie into my work that I've been doing, although I admit that a lot of the work that I'm doing is kind of from a higher level that doesn't tap into all these details. You know, but in future work, I think it would be great to do so.
Indeed. And just a tip for anybody who has epilepsy, or a family member has it, or even actually patients of yours, pillboxes. I know they sound so like simple, but I kid you not, that has saved me from so many seizures. And I've got a really nice slick one that I got from like online, and it was more money than an average one, but like, darling, I could put it in a briefcase and you wouldn't know.
Yeah, no, I've heard from more than one patient, you know, time point 1, I can't remember my pills. Time point 2, I got a pill box and I'm 100%.
Yeah, reminders on your phone.
So really, you know, just kind of laying it out, getting the rhythm down, it can be really helpful. That's assuming that the problem is forgetting. You know, of course, that's only kind of one pathway towards people not taking their medications.
Yeah, there are many others, and we won't go into politics, but that, you know, that can be issues there too. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you, I will provide links to your work underneath this video or underneath this podcast. Are you anywhere specific if anybody wants to get in touch or wants to learn more about your work?
I do have an email address for, you know, certainly for researchers who are interested in collaborating or asking questions. As you see, I'm really happy to talk about my work because I'm very excited about a lot of the things that I've been doing and I hope to do in the future.
Well, and from a person with epilepsy, a patient perspective, thank you very much. It provides us a lot with hope, you know, and it's really good to have insight into what motivates you and keeps you going, and together we can achieve a whole lot more. Hey, I'll forget what you've said, but you've given me the links to the papers and everyone else can have them too, so that we can read up on it again once we forget. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.